Hi guys, I am Professor Claire Zabrowski, and these videos are to be used in conjunction with the PowerPoint slides that are available to you on our Blackboard site. These videos are not going to go into as much detail as the textbook would, so I encourage you to follow a process when learning this material. This gives us a little bit of face-to-face, or my face for your and my voice to help you follow along the PowerPoints, but it is to be used in conjunction with reading the textbook chapter and then following along with the PowerPoint slides that I make available on our Blackboard site. These videos can be used in a hybrid course to supplement some of the lecture and to take the lecture out of class that we use class time for other things, or on a fully online course that you can watch and have the lecture component. So let's get started. This first lecture is going to cover some of the highlights of chapters 1 and 2. And again, if you will get on your Blackboard site and open up the link for the PowerPoint slide, it's labeled chapter 1 and 2. They are together. And I kind of prefer, if you want to look at your slides, there's not a lot of interesting things going on here other than my voice and me looking at my slides as I'm going through it. But you're welcome to choose how you're going to do that. I want to start out chapter 1 the way that I do in class, and that's just your basic definition of psychology. A lot of people have misconceptions about what psychology is, and as simple as this definition is, it's the study of behavior and mental processes. And for a lot of people, that's just a few words and moving on. But for me, it's important enough to pause and look at and break down the definition almost word for word, because understanding psychology is the foundation for the entire course. So the first part of the definition says the study of, meaning that psychology is a science, and unlike other topics that you might study, psychology is a behavioral or social science, but it still uses scientific rigor and scientific method to come up with studies and theories that we use and look at to understand human behavior. So just as geology studies rocks and botany studies plants, psychology studies something as well, and it uses scientific rigor to do so. What does it study? It studies behavior and mental processes. And in this course, we're going to focus on human behavior. And behavior is defined as some kind of observable action that you can look at through and observe through any of your senses. The senses, you can see a behavior, you can hear things and study it, you can smell, taste, and touch things and study it, but you're observing it in a way that you can measure it. And so when we look at human behavior, we might try to analyze somebody's mood by their facial expressions. We might measure the fact how many times an individual smiles, and if we were studying their smiling, we might extrapolate from that they're happy or they're in a good mood. There are a lot of behaviors we can study through observation. However, just like the example I just used, the last part of the definition is even a bigger part of the field of psychology, and that's the study of mental processes, things that you can't see, things that are internal, things that our feelings, thoughts, actions, our motivation to do something, our genetics, the chemicals that are released when we feel a certain mood, chemicals that are connected and produced when you're learning a new topic. These are all things that are happen internally. And regardless of our external behaviors, things can be happening on the inside, and it gives us little knowledge to what's happening just by looking at somebody's external surface. So, for example, if you were using the hypotheses that if somebody smiles, then they're happy, well, sometimes people smile and they're not happy. Sometimes people smile when they're angry. Sometimes people smile when they're in a bad mood. So observing that behavior isn't necessarily the best way to study it. To really know what somebody is feeling on the inside, you would have to use other measurements. And not that smiling couldn't be one of those things, but more accurate portrayal of your mood would be probably to do a brain scan and do a functional MRI, where we can see what somebody's feeling based on the parts of their brains, the part of their brain that is activated in some kind of a technological imaging device. Happy and joyful and good moods are often associated with a lot of different neurotransmitters like serotonin or norepinephrine, or even things like endorphins, or different chemicals and hormones that are responsible for positive emotions. So when we study the field of psychology, we are using scientific method to study behavior and things we can observe and measure. But more importantly, or just as important, is the mental processes aspect, the internal things that are happening. And because the scientific field of psychology has become so much more advanced, we do get a better picture of what somebody is going through by looking at how their brain and the nervous system works. All right, so some of the slides we'll skip through and we'll go back to if we need to, but briefly I'm going to go through psychology's beginnings. It is said that psychology first started, and it's a relatively new science compared to some of the other sciences that have been, to be identified specifically as the study of human behavior. But psychology began as a combination, if you will, of philosophy and physiology. So philosophers and philosophy seek to answer big questions, philosophical questions that have to do with human existence and human behavior. And so if you make that more specific, then it falls more into what psychologists study. And physiology, the internal processes. There's going to be times in the course where you're going to say, hey, am I in a physiology and anatomy course and am I in a biology course? What is this? Because everything that's psychological is biological. So you have to study the biology. And we don't necessarily get into as much detail as you would in a genetics class or in a biology class or anatomy class, but we do talk about the nervous system and how there's systems in our bodies that are responsible for everything we do, which includes things like emotions and feelings and thinking and moods. So we need to look at the biology to understand the psychology, and that's why physiology was one of the main components in starting psychology. Another interesting aspect to psychology and from the very beginning is what is called the nature-nurture focus, and that looks at how nature, our biology, and nurture the environment and the society and the parenting and the schools and the media and the time in which we grew up, how that impacts who we are. So we are a combination of genetics, and that's personality-wise, talents, likes, dislikes, abilities. All these can start in our biology, and then it's through our environment that these things are molded and adapted and brought into fruition. So throughout psychology, you will definitely see this nature-nurture topic brought up. So as far as the founders of psychology, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the beginning, because you can read about that and it's pretty clear and dry. You have Wilhelm Wundt, who started the first psychology lab and wrote the first psychology textbook. Then you have people like Teichner and William James. They had their own major schools of psychology. Edward Tirschner developed an approach to psychology called structuralism. He also was criticized often for just studying things on the surface, basic components of human behavior. We don't, in this course, really revisit structuralism or functionalism again after we talk about how psychology began. Any topic you're going to learn, from math to anthropology, you're going to see how it started and who were some of those founding individuals, and that's what these are. William James, he was an American that's labeled his brand of psychology functionalism. And when I talk about brand, and you read the word, schools of thought or perspectives in psychology, I like to see it as psychology is the big dome. And then there are divisions within psychology that say, well, no, this is the reason humans do this, and this is the reason, and this is the reason. So there's different ways of looking at this, at looking at human behavior and mental processes. And so a lot of the beginnings, and even psychology today, people have different opinions. What is important to do is learn all of it and then know that it's a big picture. It's just pieces of the puzzle, that many of them have relevance in their own ways. So that's a good transition to talk about Sigmund Freud. We'll talk about Sigmund Freud more in the personality chapter, but he also was one of the founding fathers of psychology as a field of itself, and he started a school of thought called psychoanalysis. So his influence, he brings in a whole different perspective than James and Tirschner, that he believes that psychology is largely influenced by this whole nother level of thought called unconscious thought and unconscious conflicts. It's not that unconscious thought hadn't been talked about, but Freud believed strongly that it was a motivator of most human behavior. His theory also emphasizes sexual and aggressive nature of unconscious processes, how we're motivated by things that are deep within us that we're not very aware of. Just the nature of something being unconscious in the field of psychology indicates that there's a lack of awareness, that it's deep down within our thought process, but it's not on the surface like a conscious thought would be. Then you have the pioneers of what's called behaviorism, and behaviorism is the school of psychology that emphasizes the study of observable behaviors, especially as they pertain to the process of how we learn what we learn. That's a huge chapter that we're going to come up on, the chapter on learning. That doesn't always sound interesting to my students, but for me, it's one of my favorite chapters to teach, because we can analyze how we learn certain things, and we can also learn to train others to learn things, and in some ways untrain ourselves to stop doing things that we've learned to do that we shouldn't be doing. So learning is a big topic, but the pioneers in learning are Ivan Pavlov. He discovered something called classical conditioning that we'll talk about later in detail. John Watson, he talked a lot about how we acquire and modify our responses to the environment. And then B.F. Skinner, and he also was a founding father of behaviorism, and he was interested in observing behaviors that could be measured and recorded. So that's another school of thought that can go into our umbrella, if you will, or under our dome. Other pioneers that started psychology, humanistic psychology, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Unlike Freud, they were more interested in conscious experiences. They were interested in humans' unique potential for psychological growth. They coined terms such as self-esteem and self-determination. They believe we have more free will in our choices and our outcomes than somebody like Freud would believe. And the other humanistic psychologist is Abraham Maslow, and he is also under the field of humanistic because he has theories of motivation that emphasize the importance of human and psychological growth. So as we go through the chapter on personality theories, we'll revisit those. But what is most important to me from this chapter is to get to psychology today. Who did we bring from the past? What theories are still prominent part of how we study human behavior today, but also these more current perspectives in psychology. So there is a slide that has all the little blue boxes. What I encourage you to do is to know a little bit about each one. And then as we go through the semester, we will get into more detail. The biological perspective is what you think it would be. It's looking at the internal processes that determine who we are. The psychodynamic is another word for psychoanalytic, and that's Freudian. The behavioral perspective is what we just talked about with Pavlov and Watson and Skinner. And that's still a major perspective in psychology today. The humanistic perspective with Rogers and Maslow, that has a more positive outlook of human psychology. And from humanistic came positive psychology perspective. Positive psychology is a more current subdivision of psychology, but is just as important to study why people are healthy and happy and live long, fulfilling lives. It's just as important to study that would be considered positive psychology, as it is to study illness and disease and disorders. So positive psychology helps us balance out that psychology has, and human emotions and human experience can range from maybe a very negative side, a very illness, disease-oriented side, to a very positive side where we can study people that have been married for 60 years and wonder why, instead of just study divorce. We can study longevity and health and talent. Those all fall under positive psychology. Then we have what's called the cognitive perspective, and that is a form of psychology that looks at thought processes and how important the way an individual sees and thinks about things can predict outcomes. I tell students often to think about or pay attention to your thoughts. Your thoughts are powerful. If you think yourself and you start a semester, this is a good time to think about it right now. If you start a semester thinking, I'm not going to do well, I'm not smart, this is dumb, I'm not going to like it, then you can create what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your thoughts can predict your outcomes. When you're more aware of your thoughts, then you can change those and put a more, inspiring motivational spin to it and say, I can do this. I am smart enough. I can work hard enough to achieve my goals. Because the thoughts you have behind a behavior are predicting of the success of that behavior. So pay attention to your thoughts, change those negative thinking patterns, and it's a big impact in cognitive perspective. Then we have the cross-cultural perspective of psychology, and that's just to remind us that all human behavior doesn't come from one background. When I teach in my courses, and I use a lot of examples in my face-to-face lectures, and I'm well aware that my examples are biased towards my experiences. I grew up as a Caucasian female in the 70s and 80s. I lived in this area in the southeast, Harris County and by the Bay, and all those things, coming from a divorced family, coming from a Christian home. The things that make me who I am aren't necessarily generalizable to others. So we need to respect and understand, and we study human behavior, and we get better at looking at different perspectives, different attitudes, different parenting styles, different time periods in which you were developed or you grew up, and where and how. So cross-cultural perspective says we need to look at things as unbiased as possible and study from all backgrounds and all perspectives. And then lastly, the evolutionary perspective is a branch of psychology that I find interesting, because what it does is it looks at human behavior on the spectrum of how humans have acted in a certain way, especially when humans first walked the earth. Their behaviors to survive and reproduce and thrive kind of developed the human brain in a certain way. Well, how different is that human brain today as it was thousands and thousands of years ago? And if we study how humans have changed and remained the same over time, then we can understand some of the behaviors we do today that don't make as much sense, or just trying to look at it from a different perspective. There's a really great book called Mean Genes, and it looks at human behaviors like infidelity and meanness and overeating and debt. And the way it looks at these human behaviors is to say that maybe at one time in our human existence as human beings, some of these behaviors were necessary to survive or thrive. And if we continue to do some of these behaviors, even though our brain tells us eat too much or spend what we don't have, they're not conducive to success and good functioning in the years that we're living today. So evolutionary perspective is fascinating to me for that reason. All right. So if you go through the slides, everything I just said kind of goes through one at a time. But now I'm going to shift into chapter 2. If you want to take a break, come back to me. I'll take a sip. I'm not as used to talking for this long. So the second part of this lecture is chapter 2, scientific method and research. So make sure that anytime I have links to perhaps like a crash course or a TED Talk, take advantage of, those links, click on them, watch. So some of this might be a little redundant, but the things I try to emphasize are the things that are most important for your assignments and your test. So the first part of this chapter just basically goes over scientific method and the research. Like I said from the beginning, psychology is a science. And so if you've studied any science up to now, and let's be honest, hopefully you've retained some of that information, then you know that there are steps in which that you study criterion that you use to study things for something to become valid, reliable information. Not to say that could not be flaws in the scientific method or in studies that are done, but as scientists, we should be able to tell if a study is done well, is done correctly, by picking apart and looking at how that study was done, when it was done, how many people it studied, or how many or whatever it studied. In field of psychology, we're talking about people. Who funded the study? What steps were taken? What were the variables, the control, the experiment, the independent, the dependent variable? All of these things should be available before you decide to believe or use or study some kind of scientific experiment that was done in the past. Pick it apart, know right from wrong, use critical thinking and sometimes common sense to understand data and information. And I say this to my students for not just the purposes of writing a paper or to study a topic, but understanding information, good versus bad information from all the media sources we have around us. Being able to tell the difference between somebody's opinion and factual information is an important part of survival for your family, for your health, for your finances. Knowing the difference between good information and bad is a start to protecting yourself and using your time, energy, and finances wisely. So this is just as important for that as it is for the class. Some of the terms involved in the scientific method, some basic research terms, is knowing what a hypothesis is. Of course, a hypothesis is a tentative statement about the relationship between two or more variables, something that you can test, predict, and or question. So my son, who's in high school, recently did a science fair project from home, and he had to start out with a hypothesis. So it was a statement that he was able to test from home and predict certain outcomes. So his basic hypothesis was if you have germs on your hands, the longer you wash your hands, the more likely you get more of those germs off. And I mean, this is a testable experiment, and in some ways it can be very relevant, but these are things that he was going to question or look at and predict through his experiment from home. Variables are factors that can change or vary. Variables vary. So some of these things can change within a study. So you want to keep variables to a minimum so that whatever you're studying, for example, using my son's scientific experiment, he wants to study how long it takes to remove germs. So he's going to keep certain things consistent as possible. The flow of the water, the same hands, the same amount of germs to test and try to wash off. These are things that can vary or change. Operational definitions. This is how variables will be manipulated. Statistics is the information you gather to organize or summarize data. Studies need to be replicated or to replicate or repeat or duplicate the study. They should have a strong study. You should be able to read step by step what somebody did, copy it, and get the same results. It makes it a stronger study. Theories or explanations that tries to account for a relationship or the findings. At the end of a study, you're going to want to develop a theory. And when we talk about theories that are used, for example, in our textbook, those theories have been peer-reviewed, scrutinized, and even, verified by the author before they're put into a textbook where we use them as the standard or the best possible information. So in the field of psychology, we talk about descriptive research. We want to do research that describes and explains and predicts human behavior. And that can be done in a lot of different environments, like natural observation, where something happens naturally, or in a lab where you can set up certain factors to try to look for certain behaviors you're looking for. An example of laboratory research that we'll talk about later is the Bobo doll experiment, which is a real experiment, even though it sounds kind of funny. Case studies, surveys, questionnaires, all these things are used to help study behavior that we want to extrapolate a theory so that we can learn from it. We're talking about applied research when we talk about psychology, and when we apply research, we're doing research to use it almost as soon as possible, immediately, to help make the world better, to make people stronger, healthier, to make relationships more successful. When we are applying research, and I'm not saying that if you're studying the stars or you're studying rocks, you're not eventually going to use that research to improve humans' way of life. But with psychology, we want to know why divorce happens so we can have less divorce. And we're going to blanketly say that if divorce rates are high in a culture or society, there are going to be negative impacts from that. So how can we keep that from happening in the first place? Or what can we do to protect children in a divorce or finances? This is why we do certain types of research so that we can apply the findings immediately and use them in education and help people to improve their lives. All right. The last thing I want to talk about in this chapter is the difference between a correlational study and experimental design. So these are two different types of studies. Again, you can look through your book and the research. You'll know that you're looking at research in a textbook because it's not the author's opinion of what psychology is and human behavior is. The author or authors have brought together the very best and or most current information possible to present it. They summarize it and present it to you, the reader or the student. You can take any of that information, look at the back of the textbook, and find the original study. All these studies would fall within what's called a correlational study or an experimental study. With correlational studies, these are research strategies that allow and look at how strongly factors are related to each other. So if something's correlated, then it's connected. It goes together. It's related. And so by taking either data that's already been gathered or new data, you can take two factors or multiple factors and compare them and see if there is a pattern. So correlation does not mean cause and effect. Patterns are important in understanding certain things about human behavior, and the information from that can tell us something that there's a very strong connection or there's a very weak connection or a little bit of both. So for example, I don't put a lot of thought into this, but let's say that you're doing a study of your college students and you ask them how often they study, how many hours a week they study, and what their grades are. You can take that data and compare it. And your hypothesis might be that the more a student studies, the higher their grades are going to be. That might seem like common sense. And maybe the data shows you that. A high number of people study, that is connected to their grades. However, it's not an experimental study because one thing is not a direct prediction to the other. It's not a cause and effect. Because if it's a cause and effect, that would mean, if it's an experimental design, that would mean that if you studied 10 hours, you were guaranteed an A, or whatever number of a studying. That this amount of studying would always predict this grade. And that's not the case. Unfortunately, we all know that. Or if you haven't, stick around, you'll have that experience. So you can study 10 hours and still get a C or a D or an F. And so there are other variables involved that would predict those two things. And so we have to look at those factors. Maybe you studied 10 hours and you studied the wrong information. Maybe you studied 10 hours and the second you started taking the test, you had this rush of test anxiety and you couldn't remember any of the answers. There's so many factors involved. So you can say that from a study like that these two things tend to go together the majority of the time, and that would go from 0 to no correlation or connection at all to 100. If you're measuring these things and you're looking at the strength of them, the higher it is to 100%, the more likely these things are connected. Of course, if it was 100% connected, it would be cause and effect. But if 98% of the time, the more hours you study, the better your grades are, we can extrapolate information from that and learn something from it. On the other hand, the experimental method does show cause and effect. These studies are used to demonstrate the relationship between two variables, and by deliberately manipulating one factor, which is the independent variable, and measure the changes that are produced by that second factor called the dependent variable. So basically, if you could think back to your experimental method and some of the review of the scientific method, that you have a hypothesis, you have a treatment variable, and then you have a measurement at the end. You'll also have in an experimental design an experimental group or groups and a control group. Good experimental designs have what's called random assignment, meaning that participants that are in the study have an equal chance of being assigned. Studies aren't as strong when you have volunteers than if you can randomly select them. And so let's just kind of briefly go into an experimental method design. I'll just think of something that you could test. So let's say you're testing out a new medication and you're going to use the experimental design. You have invented a medication, you think it's going to work. You think it's a weight loss medication or a weight loss treatment. You invented this medication, you put it in a capsule, and you have random assigned individuals that you're going to administer this medication to, and then at the end of your study, your hypothesis is that they're going to lose weight by taking this medication. Sounds sketchy, but that's our example. So you get your participants, and you are going to split them into groups. So you might have group 1 who takes 100 milligrams of this medication, and you tell group 1, you have specific criteria for your study. You say, if you're going to be in the study, you take 1 pill every day in the morning. Don't change your diet, don't change your exercise regime, do everything that you normally would, but take this medication once a day. And as you give them the medication and you give them the explanation, maybe 3 months of this, you weigh them. You get their starting weight. You say, good, you're off. Group 2, let's say for sake of variation, you're going to give them 50 milligrams of your pill that you've invented, and you tell them the exact same things, where you say that they are to weigh themselves at the beginning of the study. They're take 1 pill a day and not change any other variable within your study. They exercise the same or not at all. They eat the same, and they're going to also check back in 3 months. Then you have a third group. So the groups 1 and 2 are considered your experimental group, and your third group is called your control group. And you don't tell a control group that they are that because you don't want to skew your study in any way, but you want them to think that they're in the study to see if what medication was in that pill actually causes significant weight loss. So with this group, your control group, you still give them a pill that looks like other people's pill. You know who they are as the experimenter, or maybe you have a blind experiment where the person even administering the medication isn't aware of who's in what group because they don't want to skew it. But with your control group, they take the pill every day. You weigh them when they come in to get the medication. You tell them not to change anything, and you also tell them to come back in 3 months. 3 months time, your groups are taking their medication, following instructions, come in, and then you weigh them. You weigh group 1, who took 100 milligrams, group 2, who took 50, and then group 3, who took a pill that didn't have the medication in it. Now your control group, that pill they took is called a placebo. And a placebo is a medication or a pill or a serum or a treatment that does nothing. It's not going to have any effect on their biology or their behavior. It's not supposed to. And so that you think you're in the study, but you're taking a pill that is not going to have any ingredient in it whatsoever that's going to cause weight loss. So that you can look at your control group to see if the experiment actually worked. So here you have your 3 groups. You weigh them after 3 months and you look at their weight loss. Maybe group 1 lost the most amount of weight with 100 milligrams. Maybe group 2 with 50 milligrams lost just as much weight. Maybe you find side effects, heart racing, or other things that you have to reduce the amount of medication. But what if your control group lost just as much weight or more? Then we know that there's not anything in that medication that actually causes weight loss. And this is a very basic way of looking at it, but it helps us kind of identify. The independent variable is what was changed or manipulated between one group and the next. Group 1, 2, and 3 got different amounts of a medication. 100 milligrams, 50, none. There's our independent variable. Our dependent variable is what's the factor that's measured at the end of the study, and that was their weight loss, something that we can measure. All right, so you kind of have an idea, and you can look through the book into more detail about those definitions. The last thing I want you to do is look up and watch the video on the placebo effect, because that's a whole nother layer when you're doing an experimental design of somebody's behavior or even their biology changing because of the placebo. And remember, the placebo wasn't supposed to do anything. So when it does, it creates a whole nother scientific layer. So that helps us kind of get through chapters 1 and 2. I know I went through it pretty quickly, but that's what I'm going to do. Again, either read the chapter before or after my commentary on it. Make sure you're going through the PowerPoints. The first page of the PowerPoint is going to give you those terms that if I didn't cover them in enough detail, please review those. Those are going to be terms that are going to be, you're going to have to be tested on at some time, at some level. So all these things should hopefully go together to give you the best understanding of the material possible. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for watching.